For us as a department, if we could see the future, clearly we would have intervened. You can't predict crime.
The city of Redding in California is nestled in the northern part of Sacramento Valley. Its history dates back to the indigenous people who originally inhabited the region. The Wintu tribe had lived in the area for thousands of years before European settlers arrived. It wasn't until the 1840s and 1850s, during the California gold rush, that significant settlement began. The discovery of gold in the region brought an influx of settlers, miners, and entrepreneurs eager to capitalise on the new opportunities. Then in 1872, Redding was officially established. The Central Pacific Railroad had laid tracks through the area, and this played a pivotal role in the city's early growth. Then in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the economy was driven by agriculture, logging and mining. A new wave of growth came with the construction of the Shasta Dam in the 1930s and 1940s. After World War II, Redding continued to grow as veterans returned home and the population expanded. The city developed new infrastructure, schools and housing to accommodate the growing population. Today, Redding is known for its stunning natural surroundings, including the Sacramento River, which runs through the heart of the city. The iconic Sundial Bridge, designed by renowned architect Santiago Calatrava, spans the river and has become a symbol of the city. One morning in 2015, however, Redding was thrust into the spotlight. Detectives had responded to a report that a child was being abused. But what began as a child abuse investigation quickly transformed into a double murder probe. In March of 2014, Tammy Jo Huntsman, a 39-year-old woman living in a modest apartment in Salinas, California, opened her home to 3 young relatives in need of care. The children, 8-year-old Frankie Tara, 5-year-old Shaun Tara, and 2-year-old Delylah Tara, moved into the already crowded apartment, joining Huntsman's own family. The children were all siblings, and their mother, Vivian Saucedo, had somewhat known Huntsman. Frankie and Shaun were in foster care when Vivian was pregnant with Delylah, and their fathers were in and out of prison. Then in December of 2013, Vivian died after she was fatally struck by a vehicle. She was just 33 years old. For a while, Shaun Sr., who was the biological father of 2 of the children, cared for all 3 of them, but he was arrested again in early 2014. He was charged with drug and weapons offences. He knew that he was heading to prison, so handed the children over to Huntsman, who was his cousin, but he did so without telling his in-laws, who were the children's grandparents. As he said, he didn't want the children going into the foster care system. When the 3 siblings moved in with Huntsman, she was living with her husband, Chris Criswell. Huntsman and Chris were married in Las Vegas in the early 2000s, and they had a teenage son and 10-year-old twins, creating a busy, often chaotic household. As the days went by, the apartment became a hub of activity, with Huntsman juggling the demands of her large family. Amidst this hustle, a new figure entered their lives. Gonzalo Curiel, a 16-year-old who had become friends with Huntsman's teenage son. He had been kicked out of his father's home and quickly became a permanent figure in the Huntsman household. Curiel quickly grew close to the family, spending more and more time at their apartment. What began as casual visits soon turned into regular stays, with Curiel becoming a familiar presence in the home. His frequent visits seemed innocent at first. However, as time passed, his presence became more permanent, and he began to form a close bond with Huntsman. His regular stays turned into overnight visits, and he became a fixture in the apartment. Huntsman was grooming him, and after her husband Chris found out, he moved out of the home and filed for divorce. The household continued to function, but the dynamic had shifted. Huntsman's teenage son was sent to juvenile hall after being convicted of robbery, and Curiel moved into the master bedroom with Huntsman, who was approaching 40. It took Vivian's family more than a year to locate Huntsman. They'd never met her before, but whenever they tried to reach out, she mostly ignored their phone calls. After Thanksgiving in 2015, Huntsman and Curiel made a sudden and unsettling decision that would change the course of their lives, and those of the children in their care, forever. Without warning, they hastily packed up their belongings, loaded Huntsman's children and her niece, Frankie, into the vehicle and set off on a long drive to Northern California. Strangely, Delylah and Shaun were conspicuously absent. As the car rumbled down the highway, the children in the back seat couldn't help but notice something was amiss. Frankie asked Huntsman where her siblings, Delylah and Shaun, were. Her response was chillingly matter-of-fact. She said that she had put them up for adoption. The explanation was both sudden and suspicious, but Frankie had little choice but to accept the answer given by the woman who was supposed to be her protector. However, something else in the car was impossible to ignore. A foul, bad smell began to permeate the vehicle, emanating from a large plastic storage bin that had been shoved in the back. The children were too young to fully comprehend the implications, but the unsettling odour lingered as an ominous presence throughout the drive. When they arrived in Redding, a town nestled in Northern California, Huntsman took another disturbing step. She rented a storage unit and, along with Curiel, began unloading items from the vehicle. Among the belongings removed were the plastic storage bins, including the one that had been the source of the foul smell during the drive. The bins were carefully placed inside the storage unit, and once the task was completed, the odour in the vehicle finally began to dissipate. The removal of the bins brought an eerie silence to the car, as if something dark had been left behind in that cold, impersonal storage unit. But the full weight of what had happened, and what those storage bins truly contained, was not yet known to those in the vehicle. For now, the nightmare remained hidden behind a locked door in a remote storage facility, waiting to be discovered. Huntsman, Curiel, and the children eventually reached the small Northern California town of Quincy, a quiet remote area not far from Redding. They moved in with a friend of Huntsman's brother. Her brother, Wayne Allen Huntsman, was well known to police. He was a career criminal who had made headlines in 2014 for allegedly starting a catastrophic forest fire in California. It burned for over a month, destroying 12 homes, 68 buildings, and more than 97,000 acres. It had cost the state a whopping $5 million to fight. Back then, Huntsman had defended her brother, who had a lengthy criminal record including assault with a deadly weapon and grand theft. In Quincy, Huntsman attempted to establish a new residence, trying to create a sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. However, the tension and secrecy that had followed them on their journey were far from over. During their short time in Quincy, Huntsman reconnected with a friend, April Lorenzo. Huntsman went to stay with April along with Curiel, Frankie and her children. Huntsman had told her that Frankie was mentally disabled, and she forced her to stay out of sight in a corner of the home. During the first few days of the visit, April never saw Frankie eat. Then when they went on a hiking trip, Huntsman forced Frankie to walk on a steep, rocky trail without shoes. According to April, it was clear that Frankie was being abused. The next day, when Huntsman and Curiel were looking at apartments, April fed Frankie and she wolfed the food down. When they returned, they were angry to learn that Frankie had eaten. After they left to move into their own apartment, April immediately reported her concerns to Child Protective Services. Responding to the call, CPS and a sheriff's deputy arrived at Huntsman's apartment on Main Street. Her vehicle was parked outside, and as they drew closer to it, they made a horrifying discovery inside the locked vehicle. It was Frankie, wrapped up in a blanket and shivering in the chilly Sierra Nevada temperatures. But that wasn't all. The little girl's body was marred by extensive bruising and scarring. She was severely malnourished, her bones showing prominently under her skin. Even more disturbing, Frankie appeared to have a broken collarbone and a broken finger, injuries that had gone untreated for an unknown length of time. She had a dislocated jaw, along with some missing and loose teeth. The once vibrant child had been reduced to a shadow of her former self, her suffering clear in every glance. The detectives asked Huntsman what had happened, and she blamed the injuries on Frankie, while Curiel feigned ignorance.
The broken shoulders, because that's not from falling down, jamming up there.
No, throwing herself around. She's constantly throwing herself around, going like this, like just always for attention. When I had her in the counseling and the therapy, they just said she's really seeking attention since her mom killed herself. And
okay. You've been spanking her, you've been beating her, you've been punching her when mom's not around. You put bars behind her back and spanked her, and that's why her collarbone's broken. I don't know anything about that. You don't know anything about that.
Frankie was rushed to the hospital, where she was found to have open sores and lice. She weighed just 40 pounds. She underwent 5 hours of surgery to repair a broken fracture that had begun to heal, as detectives took Huntsman and Curiel in for questioning. After being read their Miranda rights, Curiel initially admitted to having a role in causing Frankie's injuries. His words were laced with the guilt of someone who knew the weight of his actions, yet he soon grew cautious. Realising the gravity of the situation, Curiel eventually asked for a lawyer, abruptly ending the interview. When the interview was terminated, detectives made their move. Huntsman and Curiel were both arrested. Huntsman was taken to jail, while Curiel, who was just 17 years old, was placed in a juvenile detention facility. The nightmare they had tried to hide was finally coming to light, but the discovery of Frankie's condition was just the beginning. As the investigation deepened, the full extent of the horrors that unfolded during their time on the road, and before, would soon be revealed. As the investigation into Tammy Joy Huntsman and Gonzalo Curiel unfolded, a new and chilling concern emerged. Huntsman's mother, Joy, made a call to Sheriff Investigative Sergeant Steve P. She asked how the children were, but she said that she wasn't referring to the twins. Sergeant P was taken back. He had no knowledge of any other children. Joy said that she was referring to Delylah and Shaun Tara. The sergeant was perplexed. These children weren't mentioned by either Huntsman or Curiel during their interrogations, and other than the twins, there were no other children inside the apartment. This gap in information set off alarm bells, and Huntsman's mother expressed her deep fear that the children might be dead. An investigation into the whereabouts of the 2 children was immediately launched. A sheriff's deputy was tasked with questioning Huntsman, hoping to glean any information that might lead to their whereabouts. However, Huntsman remained evasive, claiming that some agency had taken custody of Delylah and Shaun. The vague response only deepened the deputy's concern, as no record of such a transfer existed. With the investigation seemingly at an impasse and the cold weather in Quincy adding to the urgency, the deputy turned his attention to Curiel. He decided to contact the juvenile centre where he was being held, hoping that Curiel might hold the key to finding the missing children. He spoke with the juvenile detention centre supervisor, Nino Pinocchio, carefully instructing him to approach Curiel with a focused question. He said, "Ask about the kids. Don't ask any other questions about the case." The call was a calculated move, designed to avoid overwhelming Curiel while still pressing him for the vital information that could lead to Delylah and Shaun. In the cold and sterile visitation room of the juvenile detention centre, Curiel sat across from Pinocchio and Diana Venable, the juvenile hall counsellor. The atmosphere was tense, though the questioning that followed was calm and focused. As the interview began, Pinocchio and Venable avoided formalities. There were no Miranda advisements, no declarations of rights or warnings of consequences. The sole purpose of the meeting was to locate Delylah and Shaun, whose lives were potentially in grave danger. Despite the direct approach, Curiel remained guarded. At first, he insisted that he didn't know where the children were. However, his demeanour soon shifted. He laid his head down on the table, as if trying to sleep. Pinocchio and Venable continued speaking to Curiel without raising their voices or making threats. Their approach was deliberate, aiming to keep the young man engaged, to convince him that cooperation was his only option. The minutes dragged on, and finally, after what felt like an eternity, Curiel's resistance began to waver. He asked if he could contact his mother, but he wasn't talking about his mother. He was talking about Huntsman. He was promised he would get his phone call if he told the truth, and told them where Delylah and Shaun were. Slowly, he confessed that Delylah and Shaun were in a storage unit in Reading. He was asked whether there was any chance the children were still alive. He glanced to the ground and said no. As he spoke, he provided a detailed description of its location, outlining exactly where the authorities could find the unit that held the answers they so desperately sought. The revelation was both a breakthrough and a chilling confirmation of their worst fears. With the information finally in hand, the focus of the investigation shifted once more, this time to Reading, where the true fate of the missing children would soon be discovered. Detectives arrived at the Reading storage facility without waiting for a search warrant. The Enterprise Store All was located off Tarmac Road, next to Highway 44. It included rows of white lockers and a yard containing a collection of rusted cars, old fishing boats, and a green shipping container. Upon arrival, they were met with an unexpected obstacle. The facility was locked, and the assistant manager, Laurie Miller, was unaware of their presence. She received a phone call from the facility's owner, who informed her that the police were looking for her. As she stepped out to find them, she was startled to see officers scaling the rock wall surrounding the facility, determined to gain access by any means necessary. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Laurie quickly cooperated, leading the officers to the storage unit that had been rented by Tammy Joy Huntsman. As soon as it was opened, an overwhelming stench hit Officer Jeffrey Schmidt in his face. He had hoped that Delylah and Shaun were somehow alive, but this smell told him otherwise. On the floor there was cleaning products along with air freshener and fabric softener beads. Towards the back of the unit was a duffel bag and a blue storage bin in the corner. It was evident that this was where the smell was coming from. The bin was sealed shut with duct tape around the lid. Officer Schmidt removed the tape and opened up the container, and the stench of decay grew stronger.
As I pulled the blankets away, I first noticed like a red set of pajamas and some tufts of brown hair. As I pulled some more blankets away, I could see the jawline of a child and a hand.
He knew that there was something else in the container.
I pulled the blankets the other direction and saw like the shoulder area of another child, or what I assumed to be a child. And based on the skin condition of both of them, it was obvious that they were deceased and there was nothing we could do.
It was the decomposed bodies of Delylah and Shaun. The storage facility was now a crime scene, and detectives called for backup and forensic experts. They arrived on the scene promptly and enveloped it in crime scene tape. The duffel bag was found to contain letters addressed to Curiel. A black backpack was also discovered, and it had the name Shaun Tara written on the label. Vicky Vincent, the deputy coroner, made the decision to transport the entire bin intact to the coroner's office. The purpose was to preserve evidence and the integrity. During the autopsy, Shaun was found to be 45 inches tall and weighed 29.5 pounds. Delylah was 37 inches tall and weighed 18.75 pounds. Her weight was so low that it was off the charts. Dr. Mark Super, the forensic pathologist, found that both children had died of blunt impact head injuries and severe malnutrition. They were both covered in bruises and had injuries that appeared both old and new. He found that their internal organs were far smaller than they should have been for their ages, which is a sign of malnutrition. The body starts to take protein away from the organs, he said. The pathologist further found that Delylah had a blood clot on her brain, which was evidence of trauma. She had a swollen brain and a nearly healed right humerus fracture. Her lungs were inflamed, and she had started to develop pneumonia. While she had ultimately died from an impact to the head, the malnutrition was enough to kill her. As for Shaun, he had a blood clot in between his scalp and his skull, as well as a broken rib that was in the process of healing. He had bruises to his arms, legs, penis, torso, and head. As the investigation continued, the focus shifted back to Huntsman and Curiel. Detectives had 2 dead children on their hands, and a third who was severely injured. They needed to figure out what had happened and how they had gotten here. Disturbingly, Huntsman's Facebook page had portrayed her as a dedicated mother. In her profile picture, she smiled for the camera alongside her daughter. In her About section, she had written, "I love being with my kids and my family." Under work, she boasted that she was being the best mom I can be. 4 days after the children's bodies were discovered, detectives turned their attention back to Huntsman's vehicle, which had been retrieved from the Reading Police Department. In a thorough search conducted by the Salinas Police Department, crucial evidence was discovered inside the driver's side door pocket. Among the items found was a receipt for the storage unit in Reading, a business card with detailed information about the facility, and the storage unit lease agreement. This evidence provided a clear link between Huntsman and the grim discovery in the storage unit, further solidifying the case against her and Curiel. In announcing the arrest and some details of the case, Sheriff Greg Hagwood said, "There are people in our world that are capable of horrible acts of evil, and for anybody that sees something that isn't right, say something." He said that he was very grateful that Frankie was alive, and that if she hadn't have been discovered when she was, she too would have most likely died. He continued, stating, "To treat small children in such a barbaric fashion, it's beyond anything that reasonable people can even begin to understand." He said that the discovery of the children was so horrific that he would be granting the responding officers leave to recover. He said, "This investigation has had a profound impact on anyone who came in contact with it. When you see what has been done to a beautiful little 9-year-old girl, anyone not affected needs to get some help." The community were left stunned and horrified by what had happened, and questions were raised about how it had happened. It was even more surprising when the community learned that Huntsman had a criminal record. Back in June of 1997, she had been charged with felony burglary, grand theft and child endangerment. Those charges were dismissed, and she was convicted of being an accessory to a felony after the fact. 8 months later, she was charged with possession of drugs for sale and child endangerment. She was acquitted of the endangerment charge and convicted of possession of a controlled substance. People questioned how she had gotten custody of the children, but they soon learned that there hadn't actually been any legal custody agreement. Huntsman wasn't even known to the children's mother, Vivian. She was simply a cousin of their father. After they went to live with Huntsman, it took Vivian's family a year to locate them. Huntsman often ignored their phone calls or told them that the children couldn't talk because they were busy or in school. According to Vivian's family, they had called police and social services multiple times, but were always told that the children were happy and safe. Their grandmother, Delia, recalled, "I would call her to bring the kids over. They were supposed to bring the kids over for my oldest granddaughter's birthday. She said she had no gas." Their grandfather had offered to pay for travel and a motel, but Huntsman refused to call the family back. This was the last time that they ever heard from Huntsman. Indeed, before the grisly discovery, child welfare authorities had visited Huntsman 4 times in the past year to investigate those neglect allegations. The complaints that had come in were about general neglect, a category that includes poor supervision, improper feeding, lice infestation, and dirty household conditions. Among the callers was Joy Huntsman, Huntsman's own mother. She had called Child Protective Services numerous times to report the poor living conditions in her daughter's apartment in Salinas. One day when she visited, all of the children were infested with lice, but Huntsman was doing nothing to try and get rid of the problem. Joy felt tremendous guilt over what had happened, commenting, "I've tried to commit suicide. I can't believe I bore this monster. Those kids were my babies." According to Joy, Huntsman was a good mother until Curiel entered the picture. She said, "You have a 39-year-old falling in love with a 17-year-old. Something's wrong." She accused Curiel of being responsible for most of the crimes and said that he had beat her daughter. When Joy was asked whether drugs were involved, she said that she never saw any in the apartment, although she had placed her daughter in a drug rehab program 20 years earlier. This was something that Huntsman's ex-husband, Chris, agreed with. He said, "She was the perfect mother, the perfect housewife, the perfect person, up until that point she met that kid." Despite Joy's pleas for help, the young children continued to endure a life of poverty and neglect, crammed into a cockroach-infested one-bedroom apartment with little to eat and no consistent supervision. Initially, there were no reports of physical abuse, but that changed when young Shaun confided in a social worker that Curiel had spanked him and his sister with a belt. Social workers warned Huntsman about the incident, and she dismissed it. She claimed that Curiel was just a kid from the neighbourhood she was helping to care for. Tragically, these warning signs seemingly weren't enough to prevent the unfolding nightmare. The troubling circumstances surrounding Huntsman's household came under scrutiny on multiple occasions as social workers were called to the home for various concerns. One such incident occurred when someone reported that the children were left home alone, raising alarms about their safety and well-being. On another occasion, the situation took a more serious turn when Frankie's school alerted police, reporting that she appeared malnourished. School officials noted that she was always dressed in the same unkempt clothing, infested with lice, and showed signs of neglect. At lunchtime, Frankie would pile food onto her plate and eat it quickly, a behaviour often associated with severe hunger and food insecurity. Huntsman's biological children, in stark contrast, appeared to be in much better condition, further highlighting the disparity in care within the household. When social workers visited the home, they discovered that no legal guardianship had been established for the children under Huntsman's care. Although she expressed a desire to continue caring for them, the lack of legal documentation added another layer of complexity to an already alarming situation. As the Department of Social Services delved deeper, they learned that the children's grandparents had been actively searching for them. They had been unaware that they were living with Huntsman. When social workers spoke with the children, Frankie provided a heartbreaking glimpse into her perspective, stating, "Nobody else wanted to take us, so she took and adopted us." Then in August, another report came in. The caller said that Delylah had been tied to the bed as punishment because she had urinated in her pants. When the social worker visited, they found the home extremely cluttered and dirty. Cockroaches scurried across the bedroom wall. During this visit, the social worker made several observations, including bruises and scratches on Shaun's head. Frankie was sporting a shaved head caused by repeated lice treatments burning off her hair. All of the children had bloody legs from scratching the numerous bug bites that they had. The children told the social worker they felt safe, and the case was simply closed down. On another occasion, when a social worker visited, the children were found to be wearing long sleeves and pants despite the fact that it was a very warm day. The social worker apparently found it improper to ask them to lift up their clothing, so they simply left. She tried to follow up with Huntsman on 2 separate occasions, but she never spoke to Huntsman again and the case was closed. Another report came in October. The caller reported the children being left alone at night and that they have lice infestations. This caller also said that Delylah was being tied to the bed, and they shared their concerns about the improper relationship between Huntsman and Curiel. While this incident should have raised red flags, no social worker was sent out to the home. After the numerous reports, social workers eventually couldn't get in contact with Huntsman. They left 3 voicemails, knocked on the door 3 times, wrote a letter, and checked if the family's address had changed on the benefits database. It wasn't just Child Protective Services who had paid the family visits in the past year either. Salinas police had been called out twice in the space of just 6 months. They too had received anonymous reports of child abuse. The first time they showed up at the apartment, nobody answered the door. The second time, they found one child sleeping and the other 2 doing homework. They simply left without a thorough investigation. Huntsman and Curiel were charged with felony child abuse, torture and mayhem and were ordered to be held on $1 million bond. However, it was announced that murder charges were likely forthcoming, but the investigation was not yet complete. They left court that afternoon, with their feet shackled and concealing their faces with blankets. Just the following day, District Attorney Dean Flippo announced that the couple were being charged with first-degree murder. Police Chief Kelly McMillan touched on the horrific nature of the murders, commenting, "In my 32-year career, this is the most egregious child abuse homicide I've ever seen." True to his word, on the 23rd of December, those first-degree murder charges were filed. Huntsman and Curiel were charged with 2 counts of murder, 3 counts of torture, 1 count of child abuse and 2 counts of conspiracy, 1 to commit torture and 1 to commit child abuse. Curiel was also charged as an adult. They were sent back to Monterey County to be charged in the next month. They both pleaded not guilty to all of the charges against them. They were both appointed defence attorneys, but by the next month, it was revealed that Huntsman was pregnant, and the father was believed to be 17-year-old Curiel. DNA testing later proved that the baby was indeed his. After she was born, she was placed into protective custody with a foster family who ultimately adopted her. She was the only child who Tammy Huntsman had birthed or taken custody of that had a happy ending. In the wake of the murders, social service officials announced that they were reviewing the agency's handling of the neglect complaints. When questioned about whether more could have been done to protect the children, Police Chief McMillan replied, "I will tell you right off the bat that Miss Huntsman and Curiel failed these kids. That's your primary point of failure." Elliot Robinson, the director of Monterey County Social Services, spoke with KSBW 8.
2 innocent children is such a deep tragedy that is painful for our whole community.
Yeah.
For us as a department, if we could see the future, clearly we would have intervened. You can't predict crime, and that's an important principle for society. That, we don't put people into some computer and say, you're going to commit a crime.
While this investigation was ongoing, it was discovered that the 3 Tara children had been abused even before they went to live with Huntsman. They had lived in California with their mother and father, and the California Department of Social Services had documented 53 referrals. These covered not just Frankie, Shaun and Delylah, but other children starting even before they were born. There were allegations of neglect and sexual abuse. The investigation into the handling of the case found that the Department of Social Services had an open case on the family that had dragged on for more than 100 days. State law requires that investigations on child abuse and neglect be completed within 30 days after social services first contact a family. It found that the social workers who had called out to the family's home had violated 5 state regulations and ignored best practices intended to safeguard children. It further found that one of the children had disclosed physical abuse, but it wasn't documented, and that guardianship should have been properly addressed. Moreover, body checks weren't performed for each child when physical abuse was alleged. During one call out to the home, the social worker checked Shaun and Frankie's bodies for sign of abuse, but not Delylah. The investigation concluded that the agency needed to change its intake procedures to prevent reports of abuse from being overlooked. They also recommended changing procedures in 5 areas to fully comply with state regulations and strengthen protocols in 4 areas to reflect best practices when dealing with child abuse reports. The Monterey County Department of Social Services announced that they would be implementing the changes. They said that they were improving intake and hotline operations, creating a new warrant process, improving emergency response, moving to a state-approved safety plan within the California Child Welfare Services case management system, addressing workload and staffing issues, and conducting refresher training. In February, Curiel turned 18 behind bars. He was moved from juvenile hall to Monterey County Jail and placed in an isolation cell. Then the following month, it was announced that the gruesome case had inspired legislative action to safeguard children. Assemblyman Luis Alejo de Salinas commented, "What can we do to prevent these tragedies? We need to improve the law and its inadequacies by writing protections for the children of the incarcerated." He proposed a bill that would require a background check on informal guardians when the child's parents are incarcerated. In California, an incarcerated parent can make arrangements for childcare outside of any public oversight or clearance for the placement. If Huntsman had have undergone a background check when she got custody of the Tara children, it would have shown the charges of drug possession and child neglect from the 1990s. She would have been ineligible to be the children's guardian. As the prosecution and defence were busy preparing for the upcoming murder trial, prosecutors announced that they were seeking the death penalty if Huntsman were convicted. She stood silent in court as prosecutor Steve Summers made the announcement. She then exhaled a loud cry and crumpled to her seat sobbing. It was the first time in 10 years that prosecutors in Monterey County were seeking capital punishment against a defendant. Since Curiel was under 18 years old at the time of the murders, prosecutors couldn't seek the death penalty for him as well. So by January of 2018, the murder trial was just around the corner, and it was announced that the murder trials were going to be separated. Tammy Huntsman arrived in court on the 28th of February, where she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder as well as torture and abuse. She had reached a plea agreement in which she pleaded guilty in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. Instead, she was facing a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Huntsman had also allegedly wanted to prevent her own children from reliving the horrors of what happened to the Tara children. They had witnessed much of the abuse, and it was expected that they were going to be testifying against their own mother. The prosecution said they accepted the plea offer for Frankie's sake. Chief Assistant Attorney Berkeley Bannon said, "The case was in a posture where we were going to have the surviving victim undergo 2 trials, 2 cross-examinations by 2 attorneys, and re-experience this twice. This is not something we wanted." During the court hearing, more details about the case were revealed. It was believed that Delylah and Shaun were beaten to death after Frankie stole a bagel on Thanksgiving. The children had been starved, and on Thanksgiving, Huntsman had received a free turkey for her family. And indeed, her biological children and Curiel sat down and ate the turkey, but the Tara children weren't fed. That night, Frankie took the bagel, which led to a fatal beating of all 3 children. Frankie was almost beaten to death, but Delylah and Shaun weren't so lucky, if you could say that. Frankie had made a full recovery, although she had psychological scars that would last a lifetime. She also felt tremendous guilt over what had happened, and felt that it was her fault. Judge Pam Butler read aloud the charges, highlighting how Huntsman had starved the 3 children and exposed them to hypothermia by keeping them confined in a cold concrete shower. Before Huntsman was formally sentenced, Curiel's murder trial began. On the 10th of April 2018, he entered the courtroom and sat alongside his defence team. Prosecutor Steve Summers took the podium first and spent more than an hour explaining their version of what had happened. He said that as 2015 went on, the health of Shaun, Delylah and Frankie deteriorated as he detailed the horrific abuse they endured. The 3 children were beaten with golf clubs and shower heads and were often zip-tied to the beds. He revealed that the beatings often took place in the small bathroom and showed a photograph of Frankie naked in the shower. It had been found on Curiel's cell phone. He said, They'd be locked in the bathroom overnight, for days perhaps. The fatal beating occurred on Thanksgiving night of 2015, and the prosecutor stated, "They chose on Thanksgiving to make both of them dead, but Frankie just wouldn't die." The children had begun to rapidly lose weight, and would sometimes go with only one apple or banana per day as food. Curiel's defence attorney, Arthur Dudley, didn't dispute that crimes had taken place, but he argued about who had committed them. He said, "Mr. Curiel himself is not really responsible for the conduct." The testimony then got underway with Deborah Grace Adams, the mother of Shaun Tara Sr., the children's father. She said that she was close with the children, but once Curiel moved in with Huntsman, she couldn't get in contact with her. However, when she was asked if she ever made any effort to talk to the children, she replied, "No, but I should have." When Joyce Roach and Gabrielle Downer, two teachers, testified, they said that in 2015 they both noticed changes in how Shaun and Frankie looked. Downer said to the courtroom, "It was just obvious that they were uncared for." Roach said that Frankie was extremely bubbly when they first met in 2014, but by the following year she had become reserved and less outgoing. Both she and Shaun were progressively getting thinner, and they both came to school starved. According to Danielle Capuan, the school's health aide, both children had an ongoing lice problem that was never addressed at home. Testimony was presented by neighbours of Huntsman, Maria Flores and Juan Rodriguez. They said when the children first moved in, they were often seen outside playing, but that all changed when Curiel moved in. In fact, Curiel had threatened their own children whenever they played loud music, and the couple feared that he was abusing the Tara children. They never reported their fears and eventually moved away because they were afraid that Curiel would one day hurt their children. The courtroom fell to a hushed silence as the following witnesses were called. Huntsman's own 14-year-old twins. They were identified as twin boy and twin girl, and they both said they witnessed the abuse that the Tara children had faced. Curiel would hit them a lot, said twin boy. He said this was a stark difference to when their father, Chris, still lived with them, but things got worse when their older brother was arrested and taken to juvenile hall. Twin girl said that when their father was around, they had a nice life. They travelled a lot and went to amusement parks. She said that Huntsman and Curiel treated her cousins better before Chris and their older brother left, but said things got worse after. Both twins said that Huntsman and Curiel locked the Tara siblings in the bathroom, and that they were often forced to sleep there overnight. They also both said that Delylah was zip-tied to the bed. The twins spoke about the drive to the Reading storage locker and said that the car smelt really bad. There was further testimony about the abuse of the children from Caleb Tara and Amy Tara, Huntsman's cousin and his wife. They detailed how the family had visited them after disposing of Delylah and Shaun in the storage unit. They recalled how Frankie had wet herself, and they forced her to stand beside the washing machine, which was outside. It was clearly a punishment, and Caleb told Frankie that she could come back in. Amy said that Frankie appeared withdrawn. She said that Huntsman told her that Shaun and Delylah were staying with friends, but said she planned on putting all three of the children up for adoption because she couldn't handle them. By this point, Shaun and Delylah were already dead. The next prosecution witness was Huntsman's mother, Joy. She fought back tears as she spoke about her grandchildren. She said things changed after Chris moved out and Curiel moved in. She testified. They didn't smile anymore. They didn't have the light in their eyes anymore. She told the jury that she had reported the family numerous times to Child Protective Services, but nothing ever came of it. The key witness of the murder trial would be Frankie, the sister of Delylah and Shaun. Through tears, she said that she and her siblings thought that they were all going to die. She said that they had tried to escape from her aunt's home on one occasion, but lacked the energy. In the days before Thanksgiving of 2015, Frankie said that her siblings couldn't open their eyes, couldn't talk, and couldn't stand. Speaking of her young brother, the last time she saw him alive, she said, he was sitting there, doing nothing in the bathroom. She said that Shaun was nude other than for a blue beanie on his head. Frankie recalled how she and her siblings would often be locked in the bathroom without any clothing, and they would often be sprayed with cold water. Both Huntsman and Curiel would abuse them, she said, and this included being struck with a shower head, a golf club, and other objects. She testified, I don't know why, but Tommy got a tuna can and hit me with it. I have a scar on my head now. Frankie told the jury that Curiel had broken her jaw by punching her. She said her arm was broken when Huntsman was holding her down as Curiel spanked her with the belt. Frankie had testified via closed-circuit television, and once her testimony was complete, closing arguments were presented. Prosecutor Summers said, Frankie wasn't supposed to live. She was supposed to die. That was their plan. Defence attorney Dudley argued the prosecution hadn't proved his client's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. He stated, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances to decide the credibility of the witnesses. He further said that it was Huntsman, not Curiel, who was to blame because she was the responsible adult. He said, she's a manipulator and she manipulated my client. The jury deliberated for just 90 minutes before returning with a verdict.
We, the jury, duly sworn to try the above entitled case, find the defendant, Gonzalo Curiel, guilty of the crime of first-degree murder of Delylah Tara.
Gonzalo Curiel was found guilty of all of the charges against him. Outside of court, Prosecutor Summers said that Frankie insisted on testifying because she owed it to her siblings. He said, she's a brave little girl who did a good job. He said that she had a team of people who cared about her now, including a psychiatrist, therapist, and her adoptive parents. Tammy Huntsman returned to court on the 18th of May, where she was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Pam Butler addressed her, telling her, virtually everyone, regardless of how they currently feel about you, is that prior to Mr. Curiel entering your life, you were a decent and a better than good mother. You were a great mother, according to some, and those children experienced that with you. And then that swiftly turned into quite frankly pure hell for those children. You were the adult. You were responsible for protecting those children, and you failed them. And most importantly, you placed them in a position where nobody else could help them. At the sentencing, Christina Gunter, a Monterey County District Attorney investigator, read aloud a letter that Frankie had written. She said, I would like to express myself by telling it was a horrible experience for my siblings and me to be in pain in that apartment. What they have put in my life was the worst thing I experienced. If I could have, I would have stopped it myself, but I was weak and tired. Shaun, his style, laugh, character, plus he was smart. He was the best brother I could have. He would never let me down. Delylah was very young and I barely got to know her, but she would have been very intelligent had she grown up in life. I felt like I was done for good and nobody cared anymore, but deep down I know I would get saved somehow. I realised everything has a season and people can change when they want to. It is not good to dislike someone for a long time. I would like to say I forgive Tammy Huntsman and Gonzalo Curiel for their actions. Then on the 12th of July, Gonzalo Curiel returned to court to learn his fate. Judge Pam Butler addressed him, telling him, you are the catalyst that caused this entire situation to become so horrific, and there's no other way for somebody to assess these facts and come to a different conclusion. She continued stating,
"The cruelty exhibited, the intentional torture, the beatings, the starvings, the efforts to exert authority and control are really reflective of a ruthlessness that is rarely seen."
She said that regardless of how he acted in prison, and no matter how he may better himself, he should never be free. She said, "The reason I say that is because the conduct you engaged in, the only just sentence is that you spend the rest of your life in state prison. That is justice. Nothing short of that would be just for the death and the torture of these 3 children." She then handed him 3 life sentences, but because of his young age, he could seek parole in 2040. Prosecutor Summers said that he would see that he was never released. He stated, "We're going to put together a packet so that whoever succeeds me, because I won't be here, will go in there armed with the full force of this case, so that some parole board will understand that this is not a human being who should ever walk free." Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporters up on Patreon, Tyrona. As you all know, Morbidology is a one-woman podcast, so the support up on Patreon seriously goes such a long way, and I genuinely do appreciate all of your support. You can join me up on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. There are no obligations, you can cancel your subscription at any point. If you'd like to support the show in another way, please consider leaving me a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you may be listening. Ratings and reviews are a super easy way to support a show that you like, and I genuinely do appreciate the feedback. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.